He thought firing her would end everything. But he had no idea he had just signed his own downfall. The glass-walled conference room on the 42nd floor overlooked downtown Chicago, sunlight bouncing off steel towers and pouring across the polished table where 12 executives sat in tailored suits, their eyes fixed on a single woman standing at the far end, quiet, still, almost invisible. Clara Whitmore adjusted the sleeve of her modest navy cardigan, her posture straight but unassuming, as if she had long ago learned how to take up as little space as possible in rooms like this. Daniel Brooks, CEO of Brooks & Hale Industries, didn't bother to hide the irritation on his face as he tapped a pen against the table, the sharp clicks echoing through the room like a countdown. "Let's not waste any more time," he said, his voice smooth but edged with something colder, something rehearsed. "Clara Whitmore, your position with this company is being terminated effective immediately." A faint murmur rippled through the room, quickly swallowed by a heavy silence. No one looked surprised. A few glanced down at their notes. Others shifted uncomfortably, but not a single voice rose in protest. Clara blinked once, slowly, as if processing the words, though her expression barely changed. "Is there a specific reason?" she asked, her voice calm, almost too calm for a moment like this. Daniel leaned back in his chair, folding his hands with practiced authority. "Let's be honest," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You've been out of your depth for a while now. This company operates at a level that requires a certain caliber." A faint chuckle slipped from somewhere near the end of the table, quickly stifled. Clara's eyes didn't move. They stayed on him, steady, unreadable. The sunlight caught in them for just a second, and something about that stillness felt out of place, like a quiet note in the middle of a storm. Daniel continued, his tone sharpening. "We can't afford hesitation, and we certainly can't afford people who question executive decisions without understanding the bigger picture." The words hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. Across the room, a junior analyst shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable, but said nothing. No one ever did. Clara inhaled slowly, the kind of breath that suggested control rather than defeat. Her hands remained at her sides, relaxed, not clenched, not trembling. If anything, she looked composed. Too composed. "Understood," she replied softly. No argument. No defense. Just acceptance. And yet, the room didn't relax. Something about her lack of reaction unsettled them more than anger would have. Daniel gestured toward the door without looking at her. "HR will handle the rest. You can collect your things after the meeting." Another beat of silence. The kind that stretched just a second too long. Clara nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible motion, and turned toward the glass doors. As she walked, her reflection followed her across the polished surface. Simple clothes, quiet presence, nothing remarkable. And still no one spoke. Not even Daniel. Not until the door clicked softly behind her. The sound echoed, sharp and final. For a moment, the room remained completely still. Then Daniel exhaled, leaning back with a faint, satisfied smile. "Now," he said, glancing around the table, "where were we?" But somewhere beyond that glass door, just out of sight, something had already begun to shift. The hallway outside the executive conference room felt colder than it should have, the hum of central air blending with the distant echo of ringing phones and muted conversations from cubicles beyond the glass partitions. Yet Clara Whitmore walked through it without hesitation, her pace steady, her expression unchanged, as if she had not just been dismissed in front of 12 senior leaders. As if the weight of that moment had simply passed through her without leaving a mark. A few employees glanced up as she passed, their eyes flickering with curiosity, sympathy, or quiet relief that it was not them. But no one spoke, no one dared, because in a company like Brooks & Hale Industries, silence was not just common, it was expected, it was survival, and Clara had understood that long before this morning. She reached her desk near the far end of the operations floor. A modest workstation with neatly stacked files, a single framed photo turned slightly away from view, and a company-issued laptop that still displayed the dashboard she had been reviewing less than an hour ago. Before everything shifted, she paused for a moment, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the desk, and for the first time, a subtle exhale escaped her, not of defeat, but of release, as if a quiet tension she had carried for weeks had finally found its end. Behind her, Two co-workers whispered in low voices, their words barely audible, but their tone unmistakable. Speculation, judgment, the kind that spread quickly in offices like this, feeding on uncertainty. I heard she challenged one of Daniel's projections. One of them murmured, "You do not do that if you want to keep your job." The other replied, and then both fell silent when Clara turned slightly. Not enough to confront them, just enough for them to realize she had heard. She did not respond, did not acknowledge them, because she already knew how this would unfold. She had seen it before, in different rooms, with different faces, but always the same pattern: authority unquestioned, dissent quietly removed. She opened a drawer and began placing her belongings into a small leather bag. Methodical, unhurried, each movement precise, as though time itself had slowed around her. And yet there was no hesitation in her actions, no second-guessing, only a quiet certainty that seemed out of place in someone who had just lost everything, at least from the outside. Her gaze drifted briefly to the framed photo, a distant coastline under a pale sky. Nothing personal, nothing revealing, just an image that suggested distance, perspective, something beyond the walls of this building. As she slipped it into her bag, her phone, resting face down beside the keyboard, vibrated once, a soft, almost imperceptible sound against the desk surface, but Clara noticed it immediately. She glanced at the screen, and for the first time, something shifted, not fear, not surprise, but recognition, as though she had been expecting this exact moment. The caller identification displayed no name, only a number, but she did not hesitate, her thumb hovering for less than a second before she answered and lifted the phone to her ear. "Yes," she said quietly, her voice steady, composed. Entirely different from the tone one might expect from someone in her position. There was a pause on the other end, long enough to draw a faint crease between her brows, and then she listened, her expression remaining neutral, though her eyes sharpened slightly, focusing on something unseen. Around her, the office continued its routine, keyboards clicking, printers humming, conversations resuming as if nothing significant had occurred, as if her departure was already being absorbed into the background of another busy workday. But Clara stood there, still holding the phone, still listening, and when she finally spoke again, her words were calm, measured, and carried a quiet authority that did not belong to someone who had just been dismissed. "Understood," she said, her gaze lifting toward the glass walls of the executive floor above, where silhouettes moved behind closed doors, unaware of what had already begun. She ended the call, slipped the phone back into her bag, and zipped it closed with a soft, final sound. Then, without looking back, Clara Whitmore turned toward the elevators, her steps as steady as before. But now, there was something else beneath that calm, something unseen, something that had nothing to do with losing a job and everything to do with what came next. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, and Clara Whitmore stepped inside alone, the mirrored walls reflecting her calm expression from every angle, as if the space itself were quietly observing her. She pressed the button for the lobby, and as the doors closed, the noise of the office faded completely, replaced by a low mechanical hum that seemed to stretch time just enough for thoughts to settle into place. Her reflection did not waver, her posture remained composed, but her eyes, steady and focused, carried a clarity that had not been there when she first walked into the building that morning. Above her, on the 42nd floor, Daniel Brooks resumed his meeting with an air of regained control, leaning forward as he outlined projections and strategies, his voice confident, measured, unquestioned, while around the table, heads nodded in agreement, not because they fully believed him, but because that was the rhythm of power in that room. Agreement was safer than doubt. "We move forward," he said, tapping the table lightly, without distractions, and though no one said her name, everyone knew exactly who he meant. A few exchanged glances, brief and cautious, the kind that disappeared the moment Daniel looked in their direction. Back in the elevator, Clara's phone vibrated again, this time longer, more insistent, and when she answered, she did not speak immediately. She listened, her gaze fixed on the descending floor numbers glowing in soft white light. "Yes," she said after a moment, her voice low but firm. "I understand the timing." Another pause, longer this time, and then a slight shift in her expression, not surprise, but confirmation, as if a final piece had just fallen into place. "No, do not delay," she added, her tone carrying a quiet authority that contrasted sharply with the role she had just been dismissed from. "Proceed exactly as planned." She ended the call before the elevator reached the ground floor, slipping the phone back into her bag with the same measured precision she had shown all morning. When the doors opened, the lobby greeted her with polished marble floors and the distant murmur of conversations, sunlight streaming through tall glass windows, illuminating the reception desk where two assistants stood side by side, their conversation halting briefly as Clara walked past. One of them offered a polite but distant smile, the kind reserved for someone who was already considered part of the past, and Clara returned it with a small nod, neither offended nor affected. Outside, the city moved at its usual pace, cars passing, pedestrians crossing, the rhythm of Chicago continuing without pause. Indifferent to what had just happened inside that building, Clara stepped onto the sidewalk, the cool breeze catching the edge of her cardigan, and for a brief moment, she stood still, looking up at the towering structure behind her, its reflective glass concealing everything that was about to change. 42 floors above, Daniel's meeting continued, but a subtle tension had begun to creep into the room, almost imperceptible at first. A delay in a response, a glance at a phone screen, a shift in posture that suggested something unseen was unfolding beyond their control. One executive frowned slightly as his tablet lit up with a notification, then another, and then another, each one silent, but collectively disruptive, like ripples forming beneath the surface of still water. Daniel noticed the shift, his voice pausing mid-sentence, his eyes narrowing slightly as he looked around the table, sensing that something had interrupted the rhythm he had just restored. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his tone controlled but edged with impatience. No one answered immediately, because they were still reading, still processing, still trying to understand what they were seeing. And somewhere far below, on the sidewalk outside, Clara Whitmore turned away from the building and began to walk, her steps steady, her expression unchanged, as if she already knew exactly what was happening behind those glass walls, and more importantly, what was about to happen next. Inside the conference room, the silence did not just linger, it deepened, thick and unmistakable, as more devices lit up across the polished table, each notification arriving within seconds of the last, each one carrying the same subject line that no one could ignore. One of the senior executives cleared his throat quietly, his eyes scanning the message again as if hoping it would change on a second read, but it did not. Daniel Brooks leaned forward slightly, his earlier confidence beginning to tighten at the edges, his gaze moving from one face to another, reading the unease he had not expected to see. "If there is something you would like to share," he said, his tone controlled but no longer relaxed, "now would be the time." And for a moment, no one spoke, not because they did not want to, but because they were trying to decide who should say it first. Finally, a woman seated near the middle of the table turned her tablet toward him, her movements careful, almost hesitant, as if the act itself carried weight. "This just came in from the board," she said, her voice steady but quieter than before, effective immediately. The words hung there, unfinished, until Daniel reached forward and took the device from her hands. His eyes moved quickly across the screen, then slowed, then stopped, the subtle shift in his expression barely noticeable at first, but enough to change the atmosphere in the room. The confidence in his posture did not disappear, but it no longer filled the space the way it had minutes earlier. "This is a procedural update," he said, placing the tablet back on the table with deliberate calm. Nothing more. But even as he spoke, another notification appeared, then another, this time not just from the board, but from internal systems, access changes, account restrictions, authorization levels quietly shifting in real time. Across the table, a younger executive glanced at his laptop, his fingers hovering above the keyboard as he tried to log into a restricted file, only to pause when the system denied his request. He frowned, tried again, and then looked up, confusion clear in his eyes. Daniel noticed that too, and for the first time, a flicker of something else passed through his gaze, something sharper, less certain. "What exactly does the message say?" he asked, his voice lower now, more focused. The woman hesitated for half a second before answering. as if she understood that repeating it aloud would make it real. "It states that all executive authority is under review," she said carefully. "Pending immediate oversight from a controlling stakeholder." The phrase landed in the room like a weight, precise, unmistakable, impossible to ignore. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, his fingers tapping once against the table, not as a habit now, but as a calculation. "And who," he asked, his voice measured, "is this controlling stakeholder?" Another silence followed, longer this time, heavier, because they all saw the same line at the bottom of the message, and none of them were entirely sure how to say it. Finally, someone near the far end of the table spoke, his voice almost a whisper despite the quiet room. "It is listed under Whitmore Holdings," he said, the name unfamiliar to some, but not to all. A subtle shift moved through the room again. Not just confusion now, but recognition among a few, the kind that spread slowly. Then all at once, Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly, his mind moving quickly, connecting pieces that had not seemed connected before. A quiet employee, a calm exit, a phone call that no one questioned, and now this. Outside, on the streets below, Clara Whitmore continued walking without looking back, her pace unchanged, her expression calm, as the glass tower behind her reflected the sky above, hiding the moment unfolding inside, where power was no longer where it had been just minutes ago, and the room, once filled with certainty, now held something very different, something that could not be controlled, only realized. The name did not echo loudly in the room, but it did not need to, because the weight of it settled into every corner with quiet precision, and for a brief moment, no one moved, no one spoke, as if the entire floor had shifted beneath them without warning. Daniel Brooks leaned back slowly, his eyes fixed on the table, not on any single person, but somewhere deeper, somewhere calculating, replaying the last hour with a clarity that had not been there before. "Whitmore Holdings," he repeated, silently, the words aligning with fragments of memory he had dismissed too quickly. A quiet employee who never pushed too hard, never spoke too loudly, never demanded attention, and yet had questioned him just enough to stand out, just enough to be inconvenient. Across the table, the executives exchanged glances, subtle, cautious, the kind that asked questions without words, because now the situation had moved beyond routine, beyond corporate procedure, into something far more delicate. One of them finally spoke, his voice low, careful. "Whitmore Holdings controls just over 51% of the company's shares," he said, reading directly from the message on his screen. "Majority stake." The words landed with unmistakable clarity, and this time, there was no mistaking what it meant. Daniel's fingers stilled against the table, the faint rhythm he had maintained throughout the meeting disappearing completely, replaced by a stillness that felt heavier, more deliberate. "That is not possible," he said, though his voice lacked the certainty it carried earlier, not because he did not believe the numbers, but because he had not expected them to matter in this moment. The woman beside him glanced down at her tablet again, her brows tightening slightly. As she scrolled through additional details, "The transfer was finalized this morning," she added, "less than 30 minutes ago, and the timing, precise and calculated, did not go unnoticed." A quiet realization began to spread, not all at once, but piece by piece, connecting the sequence of events that had seemed unrelated only moments earlier. Daniel's gaze lifted, sharp now, focused, as he looked toward the glass doors of the conference room, the same doors Clara Whitmore had walked through. Without hesitation, without resistance, without even the slightest sign of urgency. "Where is she?" he asked, the question cutting through the silence more directly than anything else had. No one answered immediately, because the answer, simple as it was, carried implications none of them were ready to state out loud. "She left the building," someone finally said, his voice quieter than intended, as if lowering it could somehow soften the impact. Daniel stood then, not abruptly, but with controlled intention, his chair sliding back with a muted sound against the polished floor, his mind moving faster than his body, recalculating, reassessing, recognizing that the position he had held just minutes ago was no longer as stable as he believed. "Get her back here," he said, his tone firm, but no longer commanding in the same unquestioned way. "Now." But even as the words left his mouth, there was an understanding, unspoken yet unmistakable, that this was no longer a situation he could direct with a simple order. Across the room, another notification appeared, this one different, marked urgent, and when it was opened, the message was short, direct, and impossible to misinterpret. All executive decisions are suspended pending immediate review by the acting controlling stakeholder, effective now. The room fell silent again, but this time, it was not the silence of routine or expectation. It was the silence of realization, the kind that settles in when control slips quietly from one set of hands to another without warning. Outside, several blocks away, Clara Whitmore paused briefly at a crosswalk, the city moving around her in steady rhythm, the light shifting from red to green, and as she stepped forward with the flow of pedestrians, her expression remained calm, unchanged, as if the outcome unfolding behind her had never been in question, as if the moment inside that conference room had been nothing more than the final step in something she had already set into motion long before anyone thought to look twice at her. Daniel Brooks stood near the head of the table, but the position no longer carried the same weight it had minutes ago, and everyone in the room could feel it, even if no one said it out loud. The authority that once defined his presence had not disappeared, but it had shifted, thinned, like a shadow losing its sharp edges under changing light. Call security, check the exits, one executive suggested quietly, more out of instinct than strategy, but Daniel raised a hand slightly, stopping the motion before it could begin. No, he said, his voice measured, controlled, though no longer absolute. This is not that kind of situation. And the correction was immediate, because deep down, he understood something the others were only beginning to grasp. This was not about stopping someone from leaving. It was about understanding how they had never truly been in control to begin with. Across the table, the woman with the tablet spoke again, her voice steadier now, as if the clarity of the situation was replacing uncertainty. There is more, she said, turning the screen slightly so others could see. Whitmore Holdings has been accumulating shares for over 18 months, quietly, through layered acquisitions and proxy entities. The words carried a different kind of weight, not sudden like the previous message, but deliberate, calculated, built over time with patience. A low breath moved through the room, not quite a gasp, but close enough to signal that the realization had deepened. This was not a coincidence, not a last-minute move. This was a strategy executed with precision long before any of them had noticed. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in recognition, because now the pattern was undeniable. The quiet presence, the careful observations, the subtle questions that had once seemed insignificant. They were not random. They were measured, intentional. She knew. Someone murmured, almost to themselves, and no one disagreed. Daniel stepped away from the table, moving toward the glass wall that overlooked the city, his reflection staring back at him against the skyline. But for the first time, it did not feel like a reflection of control. It felt like a question. "Get me the board," he said finally, his voice lower now, more focused. "I want confirmation on every detail." But even as the request was made, the urgency behind it carried a different tone. Not command, but necessity. Behind him, fingers moved quickly across keyboards. Calls were placed, messages sent, but the pace felt different, no longer routine, no longer predictable, because the structure they relied on had already begun to shift beneath them. Several floors below, in the lobby, a receptionist glanced up at the digital display behind her desk, noticing a change in the system status that she did not fully understand, but recognized as unusual, and around her, small conversations paused briefly before continuing, as if the building itself had sensed something changing, something subtle yet undeniable. Outside, Clara Whitmore walked along the edge of the street, the rhythm of her steps matching the steady flow of the city, her attention forward, her pace unbroken, and yet, beneath that calm exterior, there was something else. Not tension, not anticipation, but certainty. The kind that comes from knowing the outcome long before it reveals itself to others. Her phone remained silent now, no new calls, no new messages, because everything that needed to be set in motion already had been. Back upstairs, Daniel turned from the glass, his expression composed once more, but not in the same way as before. This time it was deliberate, constructed, as if he was rebuilding something in real time, piece by piece, trying to regain footing in a situation that no longer followed his design. "Prepare the conference room," he said, his voice steady again, though quieter. "If she is coming back, we will be ready." And for the first time, the assumption in his words was not that she would return because he demanded it, but because the situation itself required it. The room did not respond immediately, because they all understood now. This was no longer about a dismissed employee. This was about a shift in power that had already happened, whether they were ready to face it or not. And somewhere beyond their reach, the person they had overlooked was no longer part of their system. She was now the one defining it. The conference room had been reset within minutes, but the atmosphere refused to return to what it had been, as if the air itself remembered what had just occurred and refused to settle back into normalcy. Chairs were adjusted, screens refreshed, documents aligned neatly across the table. Yet no one sat with the same ease as before. No one spoke with the same confidence, because now every movement carried awareness. Every glance held calculation. Daniel Brooks stood at the far end once again. But this time he did not take his seat immediately. Instead, he remained standing, one hand resting lightly on the back of the chair, his gaze fixed on the glass doors as though expecting them to open at any moment. "She will come back," he said, not loudly, not as an order, but as a statement that felt more like reasoning than certainty, and no one challenged it, because none of them knew enough to disagree. Across the table, quiet conversations had begun in low tones, fragments of speculation. Weaving through the room, questions about Whitmore Holdings, about ownership structures, about how something this significant could have unfolded without triggering alarms. And the more they spoke, the more the realization deepened that it had not been hidden by accident. It had been hidden by design. One executive leaned toward another, whispering, 18 months, and no one noticed. And the reply came just as quietly. "We noticed. We just did not understand what we were seeing." And that distinction lingered, sharp and uncomfortable. Daniel finally took his seat, but the motion lacked the effortless authority it once carried, replaced now by something more deliberate, more controlled, as if every movement required intention. His eyes moved briefly to the screen at the front of the room, where updated system alerts continued to appear, each one confirming what they already knew: access levels revised, oversight protocols activated, decision chains rerouted, all of it happening without his direct approval, without his control. "Status," he said, his voice steady, and one of the senior managers responded immediately. "The board has acknowledged the change," he said. "They are requesting an emergency session within the hour." Daniel nodded once, absorbing the information without outward reaction. Though the shift beneath the surface was undeniable, another voice spoke up, more hesitant. "There is also a note attached," he said, glancing at his device. "It states that the acting stakeholder will be present." And the phrasing, simple as it was, carried a finality that left little room for interpretation. The room grew quiet again. Not the uncertain silence from before, but something more focused now, more aware, as if they were all waiting for the same moment to arrive. Outside, several floors below, the building's main entrance reflected the movement of the city, taxis pulling to the curb, pedestrians crossing in steady lines, the usual rhythm of a weekday afternoon continuing without interruption, until a dark sedan slowed and came to a smooth stop near the front. The driver stepped out first, moving with quiet efficiency, opening the rear door without drawing attention. And for a moment, no one inside the building noticed, because nothing about the scene demanded attention, nothing announced significance. Clara Whitmore stepped out with the same calm presence she had carried all morning, her posture straight, her expression composed. But there was something different now, not in what she wore, not in how she moved, but in how the moment seemed to adjust around her, as if the world had subtly shifted to acknowledge something it had previously overlooked. She did not rush, did not hesitate, simply turned toward the entrance and walked forward, the glass doors reflecting her approach, the building she had just left now standing as something entirely different than it had been before. Upstairs, in the conference room, Daniel's gaze remained fixed on the doors, his mind no longer asking if she would return, but when, and the answer was already moving toward him, step by step, with quiet certainty. carrying with it a shift no one in that room could undo, only face. The glass doors at the front of the building parted smoothly as Clara Whitmore stepped inside, and this time, the space reacted to her differently, though no one could have explained exactly why. The receptionist who had offered her a distant smile earlier now straightened unconsciously, her eyes following Clara with a flicker of recognition that had not been there before, as if something unseen had shifted the moment she crossed the threshold. Clara did not pause, did not acknowledge the subtle change, her steps steady against the marble floor as she moved toward the elevators with quiet certainty. Above, on the 42nd floor, the conference room had fallen into a waiting stillness, not idle, not uncertain, but focused, every person aware that the next moment would define everything that followed. Daniel Brooks stood again as the notification appeared on the screen near the far wall, a simple alert indicating access granted, executive override in progress, and beneath it, a name that no longer required explanation. The elevator chimed softly down the hall, a sound that carried further than it should have, drawing attention without demand, and for a brief second, no one moved, as if they all understood that whatever came next would not resemble what came before. The doors opened, and Clara stepped out, her posture unchanged, her expression composed, but the silence that followed her was different now, heavier, more deliberate, as though the building itself recognized the shift that had already taken place. She walked down the corridor toward the conference room without hesitation, the same path she had taken earlier that day, but the distance felt shorter now, the air more focused, every step carrying a quiet authority that no longer needed to be hidden. Inside, Daniel's gaze fixed on the glass doors as her silhouette came into view, and for the first time since the messages had arrived, there was no attempt to control the moment. No immediate words, only observation, calculation, and a growing understanding of what stood on the other side of that glass. The door opened without a sound, and Clara stepped into the room, the same room where she had stood minutes earlier as an employee, dismissed without hesitation, without consideration, and now, every eye followed her in complete silence. No one spoke, no one moved, because the contrast between those two moments was too sharp to ignore. Too immediate to process with anything but stillness. Clara stopped. At the far end of the table, not at the position she had occupied before, but at the head, the space Daniel had claimed as his own, and she did not rush to fill it. She simply stood there, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her gaze steady as it moved across the room, acknowledging each face without judgment, without emotion, only clarity. Daniel remained standing across from her, the distance between them measured not in feet, but in the shift of authority that had taken place in his absence. And when he finally spoke, his voice was controlled, but quieter than before. "Clara," he said, the name carrying a different weight now. "We were not aware." The sentence trailed slightly, not because he lacked words, but because the ones he had used earlier no longer applied. Clara's expression did not change, her eyes steady as she met his, and when she spoke, her voice was calm, even, but unmistakably firm. "That was the point," she said, and the simplicity of the answer settled into the room with more impact than any explanation could have. Behind her, the screen updated once more, confirming what everyone already understood: majority control established, executive authority transferred, and for a moment, no one looked at it, because they were all looking at her. The room remained silent, but it was no longer the silence of uncertainty. It was the silence of recognition, the kind that follows when the truth becomes impossible to ignore, and in that stillness, the roles that had defined the morning no longer existed, replaced by something far more real, far more permanent, something that had been building quietly all along, waiting for this exact moment to reveal itself without noise, without force, only certainty. No one moved, not even slightly, as Clara Whitmore took the seat at the head of the table, the same seat that had defined authority in that room for years, and yet now, it seemed as though it had always been waiting for her. The silence stretched, not awkward, not uncertain, but complete, the kind that settles in when every person present understands that something irreversible has already taken place. Daniel Brooks remained standing for a moment longer before slowly lowering himself into his chair, not out of habit, but because standing no longer changed anything, and for the first time that day, his posture reflected something different, not defeat, but recognition. Clara rested her hands lightly on the table, her gaze steady as it moved across the room, not searching for approval, not demanding attention, but simply acknowledging what was already clear. "We will proceed," she said, her voice calm, measured, and entirely in control. And the simplicity of the statement carried more authority than anything spoken earlier that morning. No one interrupted, no one questioned, because there was nothing to challenge. The structure of power had already shifted, and they could feel it in every quiet second that followed. One of the senior executives nodded slightly, almost instinctively, as if aligning with a new center of gravity, and others followed, not out of fear, but because the logic of the situation left no room for anything else. Clara continued, her tone unchanged, effective immediately. "All pending decisions will be reviewed under revised oversight." She paused briefly, not for effect, but because the moment itself demanded clarity, including those made in the last 24 hours. And the implication was precise, deliberate, impossible to misunderstand. Daniel's jaw tightened for a fraction of a second, not in protest, but in acknowledgement, because he knew exactly what that meant, and more importantly, why it had been said. Clara's gaze met his, not confrontational, not cold, but steady, unwavering. And in that look, there was no trace of the employee he had dismissed, only the presence of someone who had never truly been beneath him at all. "Clarity matters," she added quietly, and the words settled into the room with a weight that did not need to be explained. Behind her, the city stretched beyond the glass, unchanged, unaware, while inside, every person present felt the difference in a way that could not be ignored. The meeting resumed, but not as it had before, not with assumptions, not with unchecked authority, but with a new awareness that every decision now carried a different standard, a different accountability. Voices were more measured, responses more considered, and the room itself seemed to breathe differently, as if the pressure that once defined it had been replaced by something quieter, but far more precise. Daniel spoke when necessary, his tone controlled, his words chosen carefully, no longer dominating the conversation, but participating within it. And though he did not look at Clara often, he did not need to, because her presence defined the space whether he acknowledged it or not. Time passed without announcement, the meeting continuing under its new structure, until finally, Clara rose from her seat, the motion simple, unhurried, and instantly, the room followed, not because it was expected, but because it felt natural, as if the shift had already been fully accepted. She gathered nothing, made no dramatic gesture, offered no extended explanation, only a final glance across the table, a quiet acknowledgement of what had been and what now was. "We will continue tomorrow," she said, and with that, she turned and walked toward the door, her steps steady, the same as they had been all day, unchanged by everything that had unfolded, because for her, this moment had never been sudden, it had been inevitable. The door closed softly behind her, and the room remained still for a second longer, not in shock this time, but in understanding. And somewhere within that silence, the lesson settled without being spoken. That authority built on assumption can disappear in an instant, but authority built in silence, with patience and clarity, does not need to announce itself to be undeniable. And that day, without raising her voice, without forcing a single moment, Clara Whitmore had shown them exactly what that looked like.